Good afternoon, everybody. It's always a pleasure to be the panel right after lunch. If you need to take a nap, please feel free to do so. We'll try to keep you awake, though. In the first scene of Stanley Kubrick's 1968 film, 2001: The Space Odyssey, does anyone remember that? Just me. The first scene begins with a violent conflict among pre-humans. The scene ends when one of those Australopithecines takes a stick and realizes that he can use it as a weapon to conquer his adversary. The dawn of mankind. People have been using tools to wage war from time immemorial, and over time those tools have become gradually more complex and more lethal, leading ultimately to arguably the ultimate weapon, by which I mean the atomic bomb, that had the potential to exterminate the species. In the 1920s and the 1930s, German military professionals like think tank commander Heinz Guderian asked how the human factors of shock, creativity, guile, will, daring, and skill could be combined with the technology of their time to win wars. He was referring not just to machines, but mind plus machines in dynamic complementarity. For instance, how could they interface and converge, use armor en masse to surprise an enemy, or employ radio communications to think and decide faster than the enemy? In May 1940, as we know, Germany's Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, catastrophically defeated British and French armies. And while German creative and effectiveness made the opening, Germany achieved a decisive overmatch against an enemy that had more trained men, guns, tanks, and planes, in large part because Germany's enemy collapsed. At least since the end of World War II, the West, and particularly the United States, has relied on superior technology as an offset to any personnel or conventional advantage that our adversaries might have. The first technological offset, of course, was the nuclear weapon. Then came precision-guided weapons as the second technology offset. The late Ash Carter, former Secretary of Defense, proposed a third technological offset in the mid-2010s based on integrated circuitry and emerging technologies. I don't think it is fair for us or prudent for us any longer to depend on technological superiority as an offset. I don't think we're any longer in that position. Tomorrow's wars will be won by superior interfaces between technology and humans. It's not the tech alone, it's not the humans alone, it's the interface between the two. What do I mean by the interface? Does anybody remember the Palm Pilot? An extraordinary device that meant to capture the power of a computer in your hand. It was a breakthrough in its own way. It led to the BlackBerry. Remember those? Again, interesting devices. They were very convenient, but the handheld computer didn't really take off until, well, let me just ask this. How many of you, please raise your hand, how many of you still use BlackBerries? How many use iPhones? Okay. There's something about the interface between the iPhone and the human being that made it reach a point of dramatic impact. That's what I mean by the interface. Several years ago, this small group here and a few others, began work on a book to try to capture the human-machine nexus. And we defined that very carefully as the way that humans and machines on the battlefield interact with each other. The book is about to be published, and let's see our very first slide. There we go. The book is about to be published. Well, it'll be coming out shortly. Keep your eyes on Amazon. With me today are three of the authors of this edited book. The book, by the way, has 18 authors, three of them here with me. And just as an interesting footnote, the concluding chapter of the book we had written by an artificial intelligence. There are actually two concluding chapters. One is conclusions by three humans, myself, Dr. Wright, and our one other editor who's unable to be with us because of complications in the Pentagon taking place right now that I'm sure you're very aware of. We wrote one of the conclusion chapters, and the other conclusion chapter was written by artificial intelligence. I look forward to your reading of the book so that you can let us know which you think is better. I'll now turn over the floor to our first speaker. We're each going to, our three speakers will speak for as long as they do, and then we'll revert to you for questions, discussion afterwards. The first speaker, Dr. Timothy Grayson, was Special Assistant to the Secretary of the Air Force. He was a lead scientist at the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, which gave us the internet and GPS and many other advanced products, and is currently a lead scientist at Leidos, one of the major defense firms in the United States. Following Dr. Grayson will be Dr. William CASEBEER, who's the intelligence sector, who is the director of the intelligence sector at the center at Hughes, what is it again? Hughes Research Lab in California, prior to which he was a senior director and program manager at Lockheed Martin's Advanced Technology Laboratories and also at DARPA. And the third speaker will be Dr. Nicholas Wright, who's a scholar at Georgetown University, an honorary senior research fellow at University College London, and has a medical degree from UCL, membership at the Royal College of Physicians, and an MSc in neuroscience and a PhD in neuroscience from UCL. With that, I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Grayson.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you all for listening to us today. So my chapter was about the notion of how we apply this human-machine nexus, a term that comes out of the early days of artificial intelligence, is human-machine symbiosis, and how we apply it to decision-making. And it's really focused on two competing dimensions of decision-making. So for those of you who this is pretty common, I think, across countries and military doctrinal things, the so-called Boyd's OODA loop, the notion of how you build a model around observe, how do you just sense the world, how do you gather data, orient, how do you interpret and understand that data, decide how you create how you're going to apply that data and what your course of action is going to be, and then ultimately act. How are you going to use it to control your own actions or those of some weapon system that you are operating? So, this has been key to pretty much all military thinking for decades, from very, very tactical levels to some of the most strategic levels. And one of the little buzzwords, and I apologize to the translator, I'll try to avoid too many metaphors that might not carry across an international audience, but the notion of getting inside the OODA loop. Can you create these series of steps faster than your adversary? And most military science has led to the hard understanding that the speed of decision, the speed of this OODA loop, is key to winning war. Again, at a very tactical level all the way up through strategic. At one level, that makes sense. You operate faster than your adversary, and you win. It's even true in things like finance with arbitrage and other forms of global competition. The problem with that is that going fast, especially in a very complex, uncertain environment, tends to force you to limit your decision space. You know, think about how tactics are defined by the military. You know, those of you who are in uniform right now or have been in uniform, you're drilled and drilled and drilled. These are the specific topics. You will learn these tactics until you can do them in your sleep. and again, that's about speed. That's about being able to react instantly. But it's also taking away a certain amount of flexibility and a certain degree of options. So the key is, on the one hand, we would like to expand the decision space to be as broad as possible. Somewhere out there in a vast decision space, if we're not limiting ourselves, is the ideal solution to some problem we have, or at least the good enough solution when the current set of tactics are not doing the job. But then that impacts us in terms of speed. So what we've done, and a lot of the work that went into this chapter, is influenced by work that went on under my leadership at DARPA from a technology perspective, that then working for the former Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall, when we were working on modernizing the Air and Space Force and bringing a lot of autonomy into operational programs, and now on the industry side, figuring out how we can go actually build those systems that I was trying to figure out how we would get funded for the Air Force. The same theme occurs, which is how do we apply technology to speed up this decision loop with expanding the amount of options. And you can see on the slide, it really is at 3 levels. I'm going to talk to the middle level in a little bit of detail, which gets into more of a theater operations, the so-called command and control decision-making problem. I'll mention just briefly the other 2. The notion of very tactical human-machine symbiosis was epitomized in a program we had at DARPA called Adaptive Combat or Advanced Air Combat Evolution. Air Combat Evolution, ACE. And you can go look it up on the DARPA YouTube page under something called Alpha Dogfight. And this was taking artificial intelligence agents, flying fighter planes, that first competed against each other and then competed against a human being. And it was really cool, really exciting, especially when the AI agent that was really a brand new development, it was less than 6 months in development, bested one of the best aces from our U.S. Air Force weapons school instructor graduate. Now, granted, it was all in simulation. Most recently, they are actually flying these AI agents in live aircraft out at Edwards Air Force Base, and it's pretty amazing to watch the test pilot take his or her hands off the controls and say, "Agent has control," and then fly very, very aggressive combat maneuvers. So this is real. Now, the interesting thing about that program is that it was really, while the AI flying a dogfight is exciting, what the program was really about was how do you build that AI into a human-machine team? There was a huge element of the program that's focused on the human factors of how do you understand how much the pilot is trusting the AI. Is the pilot nervous and not accepting of it and not getting the full value? Or is the pilot over-trusting and maybe not intervening when the AI goes stupid? But ultimately, there's another portion of it, which is, can the human be freed up to do higher cognitive tasks that, because he or she doesn't have to be worried about the very technical, hands-on, high dynamic skills of flying the aircraft. And it gets to a very important part of this human-machine symbiosis and some of the other aspects of decision-making that I'll talk more on the next slide. And this is the notion of how you manage complexity and the type of complexity. In certain types of cognitive complexity theory, people refer to open-world problems and closed-world problems. A closed-world problem is one, can't be very complicated. It can be super nonlinear. It can be highly dynamic and very difficult to do, but it's very, very well defined. It's bound by rules. It's bound by physics. It's bound by known boundary conditions. That's the kind of thing a computer, whether it's AI magic or some other algorithm, can do really, really well. There's still a lot of other types of decision-making that are much more abstract, much more intuitive, don't necessarily have a well-defined set of boundary conditions or, frankly, an even very well-defined problem. Those are the so-called open world problems. Deciding in general what your objective is going to be. Working about the notions of how you're going to prioritize targets. Is that a valid target? Those are some higher level thinking that machines are getting better at, but they're not there yet. So that's an example where if the aircraft is doing all the lower level tactics, which are hard for a pilot to learn and take up a lot of cognitive energy, if that's freed and applied to the AI, now the human being has more capacity to handle the open-ended, open world problems. So that's an example of this very tactical level where the human-machine symbiosis was applied. At the strategic level, we've started looking at the notion of could you use AI tools to explore decision spaces. Now, this isn't anything completely new. Big business is now using this for strategic planning. We took a look at DARPA under a program called Game Breaker of could you use AI applied to game theory in doing things like strategic portfolio planning or higher level developments of a warfighting strategy. And we didn't go there with it, but some of the talks this week, including John Kirby right before lunch, talked about the notion of the information space. And one of the things that struck me with Mr. Kirby's talk was the notion that you have to be really careful, and it's really hard to predict how a message is going to land. And right now, that's an art that requires just careful feedback, that you're not having negative consequences in a message. This is an area, again, where human-machine symbiosis isn't going to give you the definitive answer, but does a much better job of exploring a very complex trade space and doing it quickly, even if it's just to help you be more fast in the responsiveness to it. So anyway, that's a little touch on the very low and very high end of this. I'm going to spend the balance of my time, probably can't see it up on this screen, apologies for the small graphics. If you get the book, you can see it much better in print. This is a notion of applying this notion of human-machine symbiosis to the areas of command and control. Now, I'll start actually in box number C there, and the axes that you probably can't read. One axis is depth of control, the other is span of control. Span of control is maybe a little more intuitive. It's how many things do you have under your control? What's the geographic dispersion? What types of missions, what types of systems? Is it only air power, or is it air and naval and all domain power? That's span of control. Depth of control is how fine and detailed you're getting into the decision making. With it at top level, you could think of a very high level being a 4-star theater commander laying out very broad commander's intent and guidelines is a very coarse level of depth. Whereas signals actuating the autopilot on an aircraft or a sensor or a weapon would be the lowest depths of very fine scale control. And you can imagine all kinds of degrees of control in between, whether you're commanding a unit, whether you're commanding a platform, whether you're commanding an individual sensor or a weapon. So that's depth of control. Now, there are some, certainly in the US military, I don't know globally, in that box number C, who would, apologize again for a metaphor and an old TV movie reference, sit in a Captain Kirk chair and say, make it so. I want the hands-on control of every asset in my theater and detailed level commands and tasking. Another metaphor in the US military is the 1,000-mile screwdriver, trying to do very fine scale control from a very high echelon. It usually doesn't work very well. And it makes sense why our most accomplished commanders desire that, because probably sometime earlier in their military career, they had some experience where things didn't go well. And they found out later on there was some solution that was outside their reach. And if only they could have accessed that solution. Someone who could have come and taken a target for them, someone who could have applied a different weapon in a different way, it would have changed the outcome. So that nagging sense that there's a better answer out there somewhere leads to this desire of everything and all to the finest detail. The reason it's a really bad idea is in box A. And we actually funded some research while at DARPA to understand the complexity theory of this decision space. And it turns out, and again, you probably can't read the chart very well, but you're getting into the degrees of freedom of all the different permutations. If you just take straight combinatorics in some kind of military decision space, this is just for fairly conventional command and control problems. You start getting to numbers like 10 to the 80th degrees of freedom. And if you throw in lower level things like controlling advanced sensors and advanced weapons and advanced communications, you get into things like 10 to the 400 degrees of freedom. There is no supercomputer, no quantum computer, no amount of AI that can solve that kind of trade space in a millisecond. So what we developed instead under the heading at DARPA of something we called mosaic warfare is the notion of breaking that trade space up into a very hierarchical structure, which would be box B. Think classic echelon structure. Echelon structure works really great for managing that complexity problem, but it's rigid. It leaves that maybe answer out there somewhere that if it's not in your unit, it's really hard to get tasking or even have the information available to you. So what we started looking at is, could you dynamically manage those command relationships and the data and authorities associated with those command relationships? And just really briefly to wrap up my portion, an example to try to make this concrete would be if you are the air battle manager for a flight of F-35s, one of the big fallacies I think people make in the military is they want the common operating picture. The reality is if it's common of everything, it's going to overwhelm them, back to complexity. So give that battle manager just the amount of information he or she needs for those F-35s until you can't complete the mission. Then, in the cloud and with new data technologies, you dynamically start exposing what other assets are available. By the way, we're at an international meeting. Those could be coalition assets. Now you can start making the data exposed. Give those operators at a fairly low tactical level the span of control that would normally happen at a much higher echelon just for a moment in time to complete your mission, and then you go back to your focused mission. So that's one example of applying machine decisions, machine understanding, to dynamically control even what a battle manager is doing in that mid-level.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grayson. Over to you, Dr. CASEBEER.
All right. Thank you, Michael, and thanks, Tim, for the great setup. It's really a pleasure to be here talking with you all. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. I apologize that I speak French like a Spanish cow. So all of my presentation will be in English. I'm so delighted to see the various colors of uniforms in the audience from the allied members of NATO. I spent 3 years as an intelligence officer working at SHAPE in Mons, where I saw firsthand the strength of our alliance. And I would just like to say that independent of any particular commander-in-chief that we might have, that our institutions are structured in a way that we acknowledge and honor our Article 5 commitments. And I think literally every day about the sacrifices that NATO members have made as part of ISAF forces in Afghanistan before that operation ended. So irrespective of what you may see in the news, there are many members of our institutions and military who acknowledge the strength of our alliance and are mindful of the sacrifices of blood and treasure that have been made under our Article 5 commitments. So part of what makes NATO a strong alliance is that it invests in science and technology. And Michael has adroitly laid out how those investments might change the nature of warfare. And Timothy has been in the trenches directing research and development in a way that makes science technology's impact on war yet more magnified. So what I would like to do today is focus on one particular dimension of that interface that Michael mentioned between man and machine. And what I will suggest to you all is that the development of new sensors that tell us something about our bodies and minds can lead to an entirely new branch of intelligence that in the chapter of the book that I wrote, I call physiologic intelligence. So what I will do for about the next 15 minutes is I will lay out what physiologic intelligence is. I will talk some about the various sensors that are used to tell us something about our minds and bodies and how those can be useful for us. And then finally, I will end with 3 practical examples of how physiologic intelligence can be put to work to produce militarily useful systems and technologies. Okay? So let's start with the very first point. What is physiologic intelligence? So many of you may be part of the intelligence community, and all of you, by virtue of being national security professionals, consume intelligence. So you may be used to seeing something like signals intelligence, for instance, where we have unique sensors that collect radio frequency data that we then use unique methods to analyze, to provide us insight into, for example, the content of a message that might have been relayed via radio, or the fact that a particular beacon that I've observed in the battlefield comes from a downed adversary's airplane. So that constitutes the field of signals intelligence. And if you look at all of the various INTs, as intelligence community professionals call them, you'll see that they all involve unique sensors and unique analytic methods to provide you novel insight into something about your adversary. So I think that we are at a point now where we can identify physiologic intelligence as being just like signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, telemetry, and all of the other INTs that exist in the intelligence community. So what I mean by physiologic intelligence is using sensors to determine something about the state of the body that is relevant to military performance. So that's physiologic intelligence. And that can be something as simple as the accelerometers and gyrometers that you probably all have on your body right now. So I saw everybody put their hand up earlier that they have an iPhone. So you have an accelerometer and a gyrometer built into your iPhone. That can tell you how fast you're moving your body, so it can read how many steps you've taken today. Or maybe if you don't want to carry your cell phone with you like me, you have a so-called smartwatch, right? That is measuring many things about my body, and that nags me, reminds me that I need to get more exercise, right? So these sensors are everywhere. They are ubiquitous. And that's an example of a relatively non-technical sensor. Now, inside the laboratory, we have many more sensors, both contact, meaning they have to touch you, and non-contact, meaning they can sense the state of your body from many meters or even kilometers away, potentially. So while I won't talk about those sensors exhaustively, I will say that there are a lot of them. And whenever you get a copy of Michael's books, of the author's books, there's a huge table that I put together in the chapter that I wrote that summarizes over 2 pages about 15 different kinds of sensors, how you can analyze the data from them, and what they might tell you about a soldier, or a sailor, or an airman or woman, or a Marine, or a Guardian. Okay? So those include not only accelerometers and gyrometers, but also heart rate and heart rate variability, blood pressure, galvanic skin response, which is a measure of how much sweat there is on your skin, and which might tell us something, for example, about whether or not you're startled by something. Functional near-infrared imaging sensors, or FNIRS as they are called. These are devices you can put on your head that sense the amount of oxygenation in the blood that flows over your skull so that I can tell something about the state of your brain. Electroencephalograms, or EEGs, and I apologize to our translators for all the technical terminology, but those EEGs, or electroencephalograms, are also non-contact sensors that can sit on top of your head that sense the patterns of electrical activity that are coursing over your scalp every second of the day. In addition, we have sensors that can look at your eyes to track where they are gazing and how open your pupil is when you're looking at something, pupillometry, as it is called. So consult that chart. What I just gave you was a partial list of some of the sensors that we use to characterize the state of a soldier that might be useful for our machine teammates to take into account for example, when they're trying to help a soldier do a task. All right, so you've got an idea of what physiologic intelligence is now. I just told you about some of the sensors and what they can be used to determine, everything ranging from how cognitively burdened a warfighter is or workload, whether a warfighter is increasing or losing their situational awareness, whether a warfighter is in good physical condition, whether or not a warfighter, a soldier, is attending to a particular stimulus. All of these things can be told using those sensors. So now let me then transition to talking a little bit about the kinds of intelligence products and adaptive systems that we could put together using those sensors. So for example, to use an automobile metaphor, what all of these sensors do is they let you get below the hood of the car that is the soldier. Right? So I could, if I'm trying to figure out if my car is working well, I can look at the car, and maybe if I'm lucky, I have good gauges that will read out some of the internal signals of the car. But wouldn't it be great if I could somehow just lift the hood of the car and observe the machinery operating directly? That's essentially what you were doing when you were using physiologic intelligence. You are lifting the hood of the cognitive automobile that is the soldier. So then that tells you about some of the kinds of things you could learn. I might be able to learn, for instance, whether or not an adversary force looks good on the surface, but is actually not physically fit through persistent monitoring of blood flow, of blood pressure, of heart rate. I might be able to tell, for instance, where a set of forces carrying out an action are experiencing especially high stress as they do so. That's because heart rate variability, the distance between beats of our heartbeat, changes in a measurable way using these sensors according to how stressed I am, how much stress I'm experiencing. So I can tell, for instance, whether or not the balance between the two major systems in my body, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, whether that balance is allowing me to adequately cope with stress. I could use these same sensors in a more dynamic context to also tell whether or not a soldier is paying attention to something on the battlefield. So I can say almost for certain that if a soldier, if I detect using an eye tracker, that they are not looking at some critical piece of battlefield information, that they're probably not going to act on it, right? I've gotten some insight into the front end of the OODA loop that Dr. Grayson talked about. Moreover, and here's something that's kind of interesting, you can use some of these signals to actually disentangle what my external body is doing from my internal states. So, for instance, if you are a drone operator, if you're a part of a team of 6 in the US Air Force operating a drone remotely, those missions are long. They're 12 to 15 hours, depending on the theater of operations. And you experience hours of boredom interspersed with sheer moments of terror, right? So it would be really useful to know if somebody manning a console of a drone, if they are losing their focus of attention. Their eyeball might be on the video screen delivering target recognition information, but their mind ball might be elsewhere. They might be thinking about what they're going to have for dinner. Or some domestic situation they have with the family. And so being able to make sure that the eyeball and the mind ball are aligned could be super powerful to create a human-machine team. Now, how might we do that, you say? Well, it turns out that if I am consciously, at the level of awareness, observing visual information, that my occipital lobe, where most visual processing takes place, encodes the hertz rate of the computer monitor that is delivering that information to me. So if I have a part of a monitor where there's a critical signal that's delivered, I can update the refresh rate of that part of the monitor at, say, 90 hertz, relatively high rate for a monitor refresh rate. Then I can look to see if that 90 hertz signal, using electroencephalograms, one of those technologies I mentioned earlier, is embedded, appearing in your occipital lobe activity. And if it is not, I can say you are not attending to that stimulus even though your eyeball was on that part of the screen. So we have successfully used a form of physiologic intelligence to disentangle the mind ball, my focus of attention, and where my eyeball is looking. And in fact, while with Lockheed Martin, I built a suite of technologies that used exactly that paradigm to help cue drone operators when they ought to be paying attention to certain portions of the sortie profile. So that technology is actually usable. All right, for the final portion of my talk, let me, for just 3 or 4 minutes, give you some other examples of the application of physiologic intelligence. And I want to do this both in terms of intelligence reporting and in terms of performance improvement for soldiers operating machinery. So the first example is one that happened, and you may remember this, 5 years ago, whenever it turned out that the default settings for Fitbit fitness monitors that soldiers were using were set to a public setting, so that when a soldier logged their exercise into their Fitbit application, unbeknownst to them, that information became publicly available. Well, guess who was wearing lots of Fitbit sensors in the military? It was US military personnel and others, allied military personnel, deployed to an unacknowledged base in Djibouti, prosecuting what was then called the Global War on Terrorism, conducting counterterrorism operations from that base. So in that case, this is an unfortunate dimension of physiologic intelligence. We had adversaries who learned about the location of a base and something about the fitness of the personnel stationed at that base in a fashion that we did not want them to know. So of course that then led to a crackdown on these settings for these fitness devices that eventually removed that source of intelligence for an adversary who might want to use physiologic intelligence to learn something about us. So that's one example, an infamous one that you may have heard about. A second example, and this one may be a bit more surprising. So Timothy mentioned how we are currently in the status of an art with regards to the effects of our influence operations. But I would say that we're starting to make some progress in terms of the physiology of influence, of determining how messages influence our behavior by looking at their impact on the brain. In fact, while I was at DARPA, this was just before Dr. Grayson's time, as a member of the Defense Sciences Office and then a charter member of the Biological Technologies Office, I ran a program called Narrative Networks, which looked at the psychology and neurobiology of narrative influence. And one of the labs that I worked with was one by Professor Paul Zak, then at Claremont Graduate University. And Dr. Zak noticed that there was a series of hormones in our body that also act as neurotransmitters that are called oxytocin. And oxytocin is a social hormone. It's evolutionarily very ancient, so it reaches back actually well before the cavemen, if you will, that Michael mentioned at the start of his remarks. You can find oxytocin in fish, for instance, in organisms that have backbones. And in fact, if you see fish that are schooling together, it's likely that they are emitting oxytocin into the water so that other fish in the school sense that and want to be social with those fish, because there is a survival advantage by being clustered together in a group. If you're a prey fish, for instance, and you want to not be hunted by the barracuda. So this is an evolutionarily ancient mechanism. It predates even our hominid history. And it is active in the social interactions that we have day in and day out. So if you or I were to shake hands and have skin-to-skin contact for more than about 10 seconds, or if we were to give each other a warm hug, our brains would endogenously, internally, produce a spike in oxytocin. And that would cause me, if I were filling out a survey, to say that I feel more warmly about you than I did before. Well, guess what else, besides social interaction, modulates the level of oxytocin in our brain? It turns out that the receipt of stories, narratives, and messages can also spur oxytocin production. So what Dr. Zak was able to show in his lab was that if I showed a short video, and it's a powerful video, it's a sad story, about a child who has cancer, and how the family reacts to the treatment of the child. I can produce a spike as measured by a blood draw and an assay, so unfortunately a contact form of physiologic intelligence, whether or not that video is causing you to have an empathic response. And then I can use machine learning techniques to correlate the amount of that oxytocin release with the likelihood that you would donate to a cancer nonprofit as you left the laboratory, real money from participating in the experiment. So, in other words, what Dr. Zach was able to show was a stem to stern, a front to back solution to measuring the impact of narrative on behavior. And what have we heard from multiple speakers at this Paris conference is that the war of narratives is extremely important, that the information war has operational and strategic upshot, and this is an example of how we can start to put some science behind the idea of quantifying what stories may generate empathy for in-group members or antagonism for out-group members in a way that can help us ensure truthful and useful narratives reach the audiences that we want to reach.
Bill, we're going to hear more about that tomorrow.
Amen. All right, and I've reached the end of my time. I will say also that, of course, the use of these technologies does present some ethical issues, and I moonlight as a philosopher and ethicist, and look forward to potentially talking about those during Q&A. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. CASEBEER. Over to you, Dr. Nicholas Wright.
Well, thanks. After two such great talks, I obviously have to say thank you to such brilliant speakers, and thank you to the organisers. So I thought I'd start with a little story of to some extent why we're sitting here that begins about probably a little over 10 years ago.
Can everybody understand what he's saying, his English?
Well, with the greatest of respect, I am English. So the clue is in the name. And I was there in London, in England, and I was a scientist, and that's why you see I'm not wearing a tie. So I still retain that more sciencey vibe. And I was working in cognition and technology in London, and then I moved to Washington, D.C., and I was working at a think tank there, and that's where I started working with the Pentagon Joint Staff. And the reason why they were interested in what I was doing is because I worked on cognition and technology, and they really wanted to know, at that time, this was about 12 years ago or so, about cognition. And the thing they really cared about, and that's in fact when I first met Bill when he was running the Narrative Networks project at DARPA, the thing they were really interested in was how can we put ourselves in the mind of a jihadi? How can we think about influencing particular populations and so on, right? How are people thinking? So the focus was really on cognition, and they were very, very interested in the work I was doing in cognition, and that was really what they were interested in. And so for a number of years I was working on that. And then around 2016 or so, there was AlphaGo, which was AI, and that was also spun out of my old lab in London. And then people started thinking in particular about, well, God, the Chinese are really good at AI. We need to start thinking about technology. And then suddenly, everyone who I was working with in Washington was really interested in asking me about AI and the technology side of of my work. And so then people were really interested in technology. Oh, we've got to think about technology. But the thing is that actually, so we're sitting here and in France, and I like to think about sort of things from a slightly more historical perspective. And often it's not just cognition, and it's not just technology that matters, but it's how the mind and the technology interact together that really creates military effectiveness. And so once, by about sort of 2021, we'd really started settling down into the idea that, there were a lot of other really capable actors out there, and they didn't just have good technology, but they had a lot of other capabilities. That what we needed to think about was how minds and technology work together. As I said, so to give some historical examples, one that Mike alluded to at the beginning. So there we have Heinz Guderian, the German tank commander. Now, on May the 9th, 1940, the British and French militaries, they have more trained men, more tanks, good tanks, more guns, more aircraft, and yet Guderian and others were better at harnessing human factors. So I'll just say what we call the mind-tech nexus. This is our definition, how human factors, such as will to fight, skill, daring, and perception, will interface and converge with the technologies of our time, and now it's digital, quantum computing, neuroscience, and so on, to help shape the character and outcomes of competition. Right? The Germans were, at that point, better than the British and the French at combining the human and the technological aspects. Both sides had humans, both sides had technology, but they were better at combining the two. And so I sold that idea to some colleagues at the Pentagon, and then we also spoke to Michael, and we set up this Mind-Tech Nexus project to look at how this matters today. And so here is a diagram that sort of just maps that out. I can't, unfortunately, it's really tiny. I was imagining a giant thing behind me, but you're just going to have to bear in mind this is a brilliant slide. And one of the things we wanted to do was to say, well, what does success look like? And so what we would say is, how can you be successful in the mind-tech nexus? And so we'd say that it's leading innovation at the interface and convergence of human factors and technology to assure our friends and enable us, I'm having to look because it's so tiny, even I'm struggling, to outcompete, deter, and defeat rivals within the ethical constraints of a free and democratic society. Okay, so this is what we thought success would likely look like with the Mind-Tech Nexus. Okay, and it's important to say that. And we got a wonderful group of people together to look at this with us in a whole set of speaker series, and then, of course, in the book that we've subsequently, that Michael, myself, and Todd Veazey from the Pentagon Joint Staff have edited, which will be coming out soon. And we had wonderful people who were contributing, and I'm going to focus here on the high-level conclusions, 6 high-level conclusions from the whole book. And so I'd say we really did have wonderful people. In addition to Tim and Bill, we also had 2 former heads of the Joint AI Center in the Pentagon. We had a former head of GCHQ, which is the British Signals Intelligence Agency. Loads of really fantastic people contributing to this book. And we also had the kickoff from Dr. Stephanie Tompkins, who was the DARPA director. So here are our 6 main takeaways. These are the human ones. I'm sure the AI ones are better, as Michael said earlier, but these are just us humble humans doing our best to pick out 6 real-world implications or primers for good questions about the Mind-Tech Nexus. So the first thing, of course, is ethics. So as Bill said, the ethics piece is key. And so, for example, if we wanted to fill our book with chapters on ethics, we could have done that, within probably about 3 months. Everyone wants to talk about ethics. So, and I think ethics is really important and is really fundamental. But I would say, especially in Europe, but also in America, I think sometimes we over-egg the pudding. Sorry to use a terrible term to translate. I did that deliberately. We focus a little bit too much on always thinking about the ethical challenges, and it was actually extremely difficult to get people who would actually write about technical opportunities and not just ethical challenges. So I would just say that ethics are fundamental, they're very important, and especially in Europe, but also in the United States, we do need to be a little bit careful that we don't over-egg the pudding on the ethics side. So what are 3, and I'll give 3 very quick things about ethics, particularly to do with the Mind-Tech Nexus. So there are some things that were previously unknown that emerged from our modern version of the Mind-Tech Nexus. So for example, now human beings are going to have to make explicit their ethical judgments, right? There will be numerical parameters that say how many civilians am I going to risk with this particular mission or whatever it might be. Okay, there will be numerical parameters that people can slide up and down, and that's something that people have always done in the past, but they've been implicit. Now that's going to be explicit. Another thing to do with the ethics side of it is that ethics evolve, right? So, and they evolve in war, and we must obviously keep our ethical standards high, and in addition to that, we must recognize that our ethical standards will change. That doesn't mean it's a free-for-all or anything goes, but we need to anticipate our ethical standards will change, and we need to think about that with the mind-tech nexus if a war were to happen between great powers. And the third thing to say is that our competitors don't always have the same ethical standards that we do. In China, for example, I've worked with China's top university, which is called Peking University. In China, they are extremely good at science now in a wide variety of different areas of science, and they do not have the same ethical standards that we do. That's not to say they have low ethical standards, they just have different ethical standards. When I was a junior doctor, I was a brain doctor, and I was a junior doctor cycling in Oxford to work in the hospital, I would cycle past big crowds of people protesting against animal research. Okay? There are no crowds of people protesting against animal research in Beijing. I can tell you that with some degree of certainty. Well, not as regular as they did in Oxford anyway. So we need to bear that in mind, and especially in the West, I think we have really clamped down, for example, on animal research, and we are now going to have to course correct on that. So, conclusion number 2 is that, especially in the United States, so I'll be critical of the Americans, because I like Americans so much, even my own daughter is an American, so I say it with genuine love. There is a real technological bias, okay? So a couple of years ago, we had a great panel with a lot of senior people, including Tim at the time, who was working for the Secretary of the Air Force, looking at JADC2, the Joint All-Domain Command and Control system the Americans were setting up. And we had the head from the Navy and so on. We had loads of great people. And one of the reasons why they wanted to appear on this panel was because we asked them about the human side of JADC2. Right? We said, well, what's the human side? How are you thinking about the human side of it? And it's something that, to some extent, is kind of tacked on at the end often. There's so much focus on the technology that they kind of tack on this human side, but that is not the best way to do it. So a self-awareness that there is often a bias towards the technology, that self-awareness is a big part of dealing with this bias towards technological solutions. And there's a classic thing in bureaucracies, which is that what's measured gets done. Okay, so if you measure something, then it's more likely to be done. Okay, probably everybody who's worked in a bureaucracy knows that. So in technology, they often have things, and so this, I don't know if you use this at DARPA actually, but called tech readiness levels, technology readiness levels, and it's just one amongst many ways of doing it. So going from Tech Readiness Level 1, which is almost basic science, essentially, through to Tech Readiness Level 10, which is, it's been used across a wide variety of real-world settings, okay? So TRL 1 through to Tech Readiness Level 10. So what we could do, and this is what Jack Shanahan, former head of the Joint AI Center, wrote in his chapter, is we should also be applying what they call human readiness levels. So how ready for interacting with humans is this technology? And there's now a well-worked-out methodology for that, going from human readiness level 1, which is essentially research, basic research, through to human readiness level 10, which is the, it's been used, again, across a wide variety of real-world applications. So we should start measuring these things as we're developing new systems, not just technology, but technology plus humans. Okay, so 3, let's talk about some specific things to do with the mind-tech nexus. To take interfaces seriously. The interface is where two systems interact. So it could be, if you're a pilot, your stick. It could be a steering wheel of a car. It could also be, these days, non-verbal communication with your computer through the types of physiological intelligence that Bill was just talking about, or it could be, these days, speaking to le chat. See, I read about the French advances in these things, just so everyone knows. It could be, verbal interaction. Right, so this is where we're getting with that. So how can we do these interfaces better? Now, in Silicon Valley, interfaces are a really big deal, and they really deeply care about it, partly because, the iPhone is the single most valuable economically, gadget of this millennium so far. And the key thing about the iPhone was that it had a better interface than the Microsoft and other smartphones that came before it. Okay, so interfaces are taken very seriously. We should start taking interfaces much more seriously in defense. It can be and should be much more of a focused field of study. And practical ways of doing that will also be things like having sandboxes. So this is like areas where you can experiment safely and in private, and also bringing different groups of people together, so user interface, user experience experts, plus military people, plus scientists, and so on, to develop things. And that leads on nicely to the next thing, which is convergence. Okay, conclusion 4, this is about convergence. So what you often get, so earlier on, I didn't know Michael was going to talk about 2001, but he talked about the Australopithecus going, woo, right? So the human shoulder has actually changed, right? The anatomy of the human shoulder has changed, so we are able to throw things, right? Chimps are not able to throw things in the same way that we can. We can throw things, and we can throw spears. So from a few, in fact, there's a paper out in the last couple of weeks, I think, on, hundreds of thousands of years ago, we were developing spears that could then, kill things safely from a distance of, 10, 20 meters, right? Prey. So we've always been shaped by our technologies, and we shape our technologies. So and in our lifetimes, you have all sorts of different ways that we interact and iterate with changing our technologies. So classic examples being for tank development during World War II was very much an iterative process where new ways of working helped develop new tanks. Those helped again develop new ways of working, and so on. So there's a convergence through an iterative process to create interdependent, sorry for the translator, interdependent entities that have military effectiveness. Now, how can you do that? I think one of the key things here is about bottom-up approaches, so things from the bottom up. So that's things like ensuring you have experimentation. So one of the forewords from our book is from General Rainey, who is the 4-star in charge of Army Futures Command in the US, and they're really trying to build in experimentation, sandboxes, and all the rest of it. Red teams. But then sometimes you also need to think about not only bottom-up approaches, but also top-down approaches. Okay, so you might have to reimagine entire processes. Right, or conjure up new things like aircraft carriers, which didn't exist in World War I. So, and I'd just say this is just to be a bit provocative, although maybe nobody wants me to. Oh, what's that? 1 minute. All right. Number five. Vulnerabilities. At the beginning, you saw a picture of Heinz Guderian, and you also saw, if it had been a bigger picture, you'd have seen lots of people communicating with each other. Okay, and they were using Enigma machines, and actually, obviously, the British cracked the Enigma code, so we were listening into a lot of key information. All of this new Mindset Nexus stuff, all the great stuff that Tim and Bill were talking about, a lot of it's going to be hacked into. Right? So we need to be thinking about our vulnerabilities. We need to be thinking about other people's vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities also matter because China, for example, is explicitly thinking about systems survival. So they are thinking about how their systems can be degraded, how they can try and cope with vulnerabilities. We need to be doing the same. And we also need to think about how we can potentially worry about them suppressing our warfighters, and we also need to think about how we might think about suppressing their warfighters' performance. And the final thing is point 6, the 6th conclusion, is that we often actually really don't know what competitors are doing with the Mindset Nexus, right? So how you combine human factors with the technologies of your time to create military effectiveness has been important since time immemorial. And yet, what really are the Chinese doing? What really are the Russians doing? So I made the joke when we were putting the book together that we're going to look for someone to tell us about what Russia's doing in this space, and we'll go through all our different networks, which are great networks in DC and all across America and Europe and whatever, and then we'll end up with Sam Bendit writing the chapter, and lo and behold, it was Sam. If he gets run over by a bus, that poor we'll lose all of our knowledge about Russia, because it's always Sam Bendit who writes the chapter on Russia. Very few people really know what on earth is going on, and certainly in the public sphere, and are prepared to talk about it. And it's the same thing with China. It was extremely difficult. There are loads of people who talk generically about China, but people who could actually say anything useful was far in between, few and far between. So I think we want to make sure that we are not surprised, as people have often been in the past. And I'll just conclude by saying, we need to keep up with the character of conflict, but we also need to remember that yes, we need to keep current with the latest technologies, but also remember that the nature of war is still, and for the foreseeable future will remain, fundamentally human, and that we need to think about how these new technologies will interact with things like the will to fight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.